Sudan. The first is going to be by Dr. El-Atabani, who is a professor in Sudanese University, and she's got higher studies diploma from Birmingham University in the UK, and a master's from Khartoum University, and PhD in development and peace building from Sudan. And she used to run many institutions and have many publications and studies, and she writes a weekly article in Al-Ra'y Al-Aam public opinion newspaper, and she has a book on identity and multi-ethnicity in South Sudan, and also on the issues of modern states. This would be followed by another intervention by Professor Ahmed Makki, who is a professor in the International African University. He's got his PhD in 1989, and he got his professorship later, and he was a scholar in the African Sudanese Studies Center, and he contributed to the curricula of the African Studies Center. He has more than 30 published books. And Dr. Hassan Makki, Professor Hassan Makki, unfortunately, is down with severe flu, but in his stead, we will have Mr. Walid Al-Tayyib, who is a Sudanese journalist, and he is going to present Dr. Makki's paper on his behalf. Finally, we will have the final paper in this session, which is for Dr. Ibrahim Bashir, who is a former academic, and he's got his master's degree from the Ohio University in the United States and a PhD in political science in 1984 from California Riverside University. He was a political science professor in Umdurman Islamic University and Malik Saud University in Riyadh, and he also worked in multiple countries, including Malaysia, Belarus, Russia, and elsewhere. And when he used to work for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he was the manager of Arab Affairs and also political affairs, and he contributed to the Council of External and Foreign Relations. He contributed to the formulation of a number of legislations related to foreign affairs, and he also contributed to Sudanese foreign affairs and relations. I like to welcome all of our speakers. They would be followed by a number of commentators as well, whom I will introduce after the presentation. We will start with the presentation of Dr. Adil Ahmed Hassan. Please, the floor is yours, sir.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. At the beginning, I would like to thank those who are responsible for organizing this significant event and for the invitation to take part in this event. And I would like to welcome all of the attendees. I speak in this paper about the importance of examining the experience of the Islamic movement over the 4 decades that preceded their taking power in Sudan. So at the beginning, there was no strategic vision for the Islamic movement in Sudan. However, the pragmatic and tactical positions made the Islamic movement sometimes take military action for change and to take power, whether by individual decision making, such as the attempted coup by Al-Rashid Al-Tahir in 1959, or with consensus such as the coup of Omar al-Bashir in 1989. And in taking this military action methodology, um, the Islamic movement also in after its alliance with Al-Numeri, the movement started to take up military action, such as in the 70s, when members of the Islamic movement with forces from Al-Ummah party contributed in military action against the regime of Al-Numeri, which was crushed very violently with the three countries, Egypt, Libya, and the USSR, and there were many people who were martyred in this a confrontation. After the coup of 1969. Also, the movement with the Al-Ummah party was restricted by the regime, and they started to move to Libya, and then they staged this attempted coup in 1975, and many of those who were involved in this attempt were sentenced to death by death squad. And also in 1976 there was another attempt that was brutally crushed, and for 2 days Khartoum was a battlefield with members of the coup who were associated with members of the Islamic movement. After this attempt, Al-Numeri proposed the National Reconciliation Project in 1977, and he released Mr. Hassan al-Turabi, and the members of the Islamic movement returned to Sudan, which attracted a lot of people to this movement, which also was supported by the adoption by Al-Numeri of Islamic laws in 1983 or 84. So after those failed attempts, the movement was convinced that there is no political change with armed factions, so they used this time in Sudanese history, and they started to introduce some of their elements to the army, and they used the time of the reconciliation. And the officers of the armed forces were sent to study Sharia and to study Islamic sciences. And then there was this concern also, and interest in security and police officers. Some of the speakers yesterday also referred that before the government of salvation, the situation in Sudan was full of fierce crises, and there were military operations by the National Front led by Garang, and also there was economic problems, and also much into external intervention. And all of this culminated in February in the visit of one of our officers, of the Sudanese officers, to Arab countries to ask for military support, after which he was disappointed and resigned from office. And this was a dire situation for the army, especially with the war with the south, so the government started to look for external resources, or had to reach a compromise with the movement in the south. And then there was the peace initiative with Uthman al-Marghali, and it was signed in November 1988. And this agreement reached a cessation of hostility and a suspension of joint defense agreements with Libya and Egypt. It was at the beginning rejected by the conference, and there were protests because of the living conditions and because of the performance of the government. But there was a liberal movement in support of this agreement, so the former prime minister had to dissolve the government and formulate a government from Al-Ummah and the Federal Party, excluding the Islamic movement. So the Islamists considered that a coup against them. So this constituted an existential threat to the movement. So they thought of a military coup. Those who planned this coup were the cadres of the Muslim or the Islamic movement in the armed forces and the police, and it was staged and implemented by taking control of all the key uh, institutions, and it was faced with minimal resistance, after which the Salvation government was formulated, headed by Omar El-Bashir, and it was involved in trying to secure the goals of the revolution at the time. After this formulation of the government of salvation in 1989, the government held a conference to discuss development and peace. At the same time, it worked with the security and the armed forces in order to promote peace and self-defense. After this conference and commitment to its outcome, the government of salvation started a serious dialogue with the other components that used to take control of wide areas of Sudan in order to reach an agreement for the best of all of Sudan. And this dialogue aimed at reaching a root to address the root causes of the problems, and there were a number of agreements such as Addis Ababa and others, as well as the outcomes of the national dialogue on peace issues. And after the government of salvation was involved in this, it faced a siege from on all levels, and at the same time we had the movement in the south receiving all sorts of support. So the government of salvation was in a proxy war with a proxy uh, uh, party in the north on behalf of the Ziono Christian forces, external forces.
واستثمار كذلك الفرص المتاحة في البيئات الخارجية.
So the strategy of the popular supporting forces used by the Islamic movement. So in addition to the army, there was the popular forces, and besides the police, there was the popular police or the community police. So the movement tried to mobilize all the people to involve them in war-related actions. So in 1995, the army was 1 million strong, and also it worked on the rehabilitation of the army and security forces from human resources and infrastructure point of view. They also worked on the modernization of industry, particularly the making of heavy vehicles and armored vehicles, and Sudan became developed in terms of making manufacturing light weapons and machinery. And also many of the officers from Arab countries and African countries were also qualified and trained in Sudan, with the establishment of many institutes, military institutes affiliated with the armed forces. Hence, the Islamic forces also provided the families of those in the armed forces with all sorts of support. This led actually directly to an improvement in development and in the GDP and in the support of agriculture because of direct subsidies. Also, the armed forces made use of the support by countries such as China, Russia, Belarus, and to make weapons, and also to acquire some strategic weapons. And also we had Syria and Iraq, who provided their military and logistic support to the Sudanese army. And after attempts to reach peace with the national movement, and after their refusal to do so, and at a failure of all attempts to reach this peace, they started military operations. Also, some tribes in the south that were allies to the armed forces supported the armed forces, so the army applied its plans in the Nile and the Blue Nile and elsewhere, and those armed forces and popular resistance, including scientists, civilians, students, even women, who provided in these battles many sacrifices. And they talked about Sudan as the area of sacrifice and the arena for sacrifice, and many Sudanese declared Sudan and volunteered to fight in south of Sudan. But given the international support of the rebellion in the south, some coordinated operations were undertaken in cooperation with external support from Rwanda, Eritrea, and Ethiopia in order to take over Juba. But the Sudanese army was able to face all that and to liberate the south. The army also was involved in its liberation battles in the Nuba mountains and elsewhere, but the intervention of China in Sudan and its investment in the oil sector supported the government. So it supported the peace talks in Kenya.
فصول جديدة وواجهت فيها تحدي كبير للتحالف.
But there were some other challenges.
عبوات الدعم السريع تحت إشراف جهاز الأمن والثورات الوطني قبل أن يبدأ يتبع لرئاسة الجمهورية ويكون
where
دكتور عادل لو سمحت الصوت يتقطع قليلا ممكن تقرب من الميكروفون. الآن الصوت ذهب تماما، الآن لا نسمع. لو تقرب الميكروفون ممكن تقربه قليلا. بقية الإخوة إذا ممكن ميوت. خرطوم 3 إذا ميوت. تفضل.
انت خرطوم.
تفضل دكتور عادل، أكمل.
Dr. Adil, you can go ahead now. We're waiting for our colleagues in Khartoum to reconnect. I can see that Sudan 2 is still working, but Sudan 1 the screen has frozen.
تدخلوا مرة ثانية.
استطاع الجيش السوداني أن يواجه كل التحديات في جنوب السودان ويحرر أراضي الجنوب من سيطرة الحركة الشعبية.
So, after having included some effective elements from the Islamic movement, also they were involved in eastern Sudan, Nuba Mountains, and trying to secure northern borders under international siege also. But the intervention of China and its investment in the oil sector supported the government of Sudan, forcing the international community to be involved in the or to support the Kenya peace talks, after which the Darfur war entered new chapters in which the army faced new challenges and was forced to effect alliances with some local tribes and establish a new force, after which those forces were affiliated with the cabinet, and a new law was introduced in order to confront the armed militias. Since the establishment of the government of salvation, the army faced many challenges. There were a number of attempts that were failed, including in 2013, including elements from the army and the security apparatus. The problems between the presidency and the Islamic movement caused some disruption in the ranks of the movement, and the movement was not very concerned with the army and the security because in May they were against the movement, particularly as for the securing of the government of salvation. The movement tried to support with its best elements and resources, focusing on internal and external security of Sudan, and they got involved in security, the army, but also technology, communication, and support to military industries and manufacturing, and also they undertook important operations such as arresting Carlos, who after this apparatus became pivotal and essential in undertaking government policies, it was divided into two branches, external and internal, and after the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2005, it was reintegrated into one apparatus again. So a number of members of the popular movement were involved in this apparatus, and this apparatus was key in information exchange with the security, National Security Committee, and it worked on the improvement of external and foreign relations with Sudan by also exchanging information and intelligence with international agencies, and particularly in relation to terrorists and counterterrorism, which also improved the relations with international states, and hence the Sudan was not subjected to a military strike and was not on the hit list after 9/11, like what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. The apparatus was essential in establishing peace and security in Africa by contributing to the SIDA, affiliated to the African Council, and also contributing to the Federation of Intelligence and Security Agencies on an Islamic level. The apparatus paid much attention to its special operations and its forces alongside the armed forces, and they were supposed to also protect the capital as well as key and vital oil fields and other strategic areas. The security apparatus also worked to improve the perception in Sudanese imagination and public opinion, and so it worked on its media and on feedback loop with the public, and also introduced higher education degree in security in order to methodologize their work. Dr. Adil, you have only 5 minutes left. But with the challenges, external and internal, of the government, they caused much weakening of the performance in security and development terms. So the pressure was on the security apparatus to face the upheaval in 2019. Of course, there are many setbacks. My presentation should not overlook. So many observers have talked about those setbacks, and they were mentioned in my detailed paper. There were also many disadvantages in terms of circulating the information among the ranks of those working in the security apparatus, and this is related to the nature of their work as well. I stop here, and I would be happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Adil. for introducing and presenting this paper. Dr. Adil at the beginning talked about the point of principle that the Islamic movement took by refraining from military action, but that there were many developments that led to the intervention of the Islamic movement in military action from the beginning. And he talked about in the attempt by Sidi Tahir in 1959, and finally with the coup of Omar al-Bashir in 1989, including in the meanwhile other attempts in the 70s around the time of Numeri's reign, and also another attempt from Libya to come to Khartoum and throw down the Numeri regime, and again in 1976, which led to some life sentences and death sentences until Numeri decided to introduce the National Reconciliation in 1977, after which the General Secretary Hassan al-Turabi was released, and many of the ranks of the Islamic movement returned to Sudan, after which they started to adopt Islamic laws in 1986. Dr. Adil also mentioned that there was a recognition by the movement that no political change can be effected through the work of militias, but through the work within the police and armed forces apparatuses. So they worked on introducing the members. They're including those who took up the coup in 1989. But he also said that on the eve of the government of salvation, there were many crises that we referred to in previous papers. There was a rebellion in the south. Sorry, there were external interventions. The army did not receive the Arab support for the armed forces. The memorandum was written by the prime minister to the army, particularly in relation to the war in the south that the army was losing, until we reached a peace initiative in which the Islamic legislations were abolished. But there was much division in the Sudanese ranks, which led the Sadiq al-Mahdi to dissolve the government and to establish a new government, which the Islamic movement considered a coup or a way to put pressure on it. So the people at the time in the Islamic movement believed at the time that their only choice was to stage a coup, which is what they had made, what they did in 1989. And he also said that that coup was not a bloody coup, but it was a clean coup. And they established a government. They wanted to lift the capacities of the army, and they involved in negotiations with Garang. But nonetheless, there was much siege in political and external terms, and the rebellion movement was not small. It was strong and internationally supported. The strategy that was followed by the movement at the time in the government of salvation was the establishment of popular forces or community police or national service, and mobilizing the people to reach 1 million strong in forces to undertake the protection of the state, including also the manufacturing of modern weapons and light weapons, and the training of officers and security officers, and the establishment of economic projects, and making use of the support of some friendly countries such as Iran, China, Russia, Belarus, and Iraq and Syria at the time. After the failure of peace talks with the South, there was the battle in which much of the community was involved, after which we had those peace negotiations. And despite all the alliances with the rebellion in the south, the government was able to end the battle in its favor, and he believes that's due to the Chinese support, economic support. Uh, at the time also, there were several coups that were failed against the Sudanese government, staged by officers who used to affiliate with Al-Ba'ath or other parties, and he believes that the Islamic movement has introduced its members to the security apparatus or police or army forces and supported it with its best resources, and also helped in improving and developing this security apparatus, which has undertaken for years the improvement of the defense of the country and improving even its foreign relations. And that it's thanks to this apparatus that Sudan was away from the repercussions of the 1911 reprisal operations, and it improved its relations with the United States. Sudan was not subject to military strikes, and the mission of the apparatus was to protect vital and strategic places and locations. Despite a mention of setbacks or disadvantages, did not elaborate there. Thank you so much, Dr. Adil, for what you have said. And now we move to the second paper on the separation of South of Sudan. Dr. Howaida, please go ahead.
In the name of God, the most merciful, the most bountiful. ليش ما تردي على الواتس؟ Thank you for this symposium, and I'm going to talk not about the division of Sudan, but it is a reading in the peace treaties or the peace treaty in Sudan. Of course, the division or the separation in Sudan will be one of the topics that will be tackled in my paper. Although it is a history, but it can be also a mirror to understand the future or to look for the future if we have any agreements in the future between the central government and the ones and the other governments. So this can be a source of lessons to learn. There are a lot of complicated issues in Sudan that led to tribal conflicts, ethnic conflicts, and led to an increase of migration, displacement, and internally displaced persons. And it is well known that the war between the north and south of Sudan continued for about half a century. And the Southerners called for separation, sometimes through the call of federation and sometimes by the political pressure and the call for self-determination or other calls. Sometimes these calls used to take shape or in the form of treaties and agreements with the central government in the north. All of that was supposed to give the Southerners assurances for political independence and freedom and the freedom to control their sources. There were so many initiatives and attempts to solve these well-rooted or deeply rooted problems between the south and the north through different regimes since the independence. And as you know, those regimes were either authoritarian military governments, a dictatorship that governed for a long time, or they were democratic, partisan, weak regimes. We say, unfortunately, that the democratic regimes were not given in enough time in governance to prove themselves. But in those short periods, they were always busy trying to take pieces of the authority cake, so to speak, and to get into internal problems or partisan problems. I always remember that uh, the two governments, the second democratic government and the third democratic government, the government was changed 5 times in about 3 years. And all of that was due to the differences and the influence of the two main parties. In this paper, I'm going to touch upon the agreements, but because of the short time allocated, I will try to go quickly about on the agreements. Between 1964 and 1969, after the October Revolution, the axis of the South was one of the most important axes for the government in at that time. And one of the issues that sparked the revolution was the lecture delivered by Hassan al-Turabi, and he said that the solution is should be political and not military one. Of course, that lecture was not the main reason, but I believe that that was the spark that led to the eruption of the revolution. So that axis was a very important one. And one of the most important strategies of the second democratic government was to have conferences. There was the Roundtable Conference in March 1965, and this one of the most important outputs of this conference was raising awareness of the people about the problems. So one of the most important outcomes were the constitutional reform. And after that, after the roundtable conference, it was decided to make a committee or to establish a committee of 12 persons, six from the north and six from the south, in order to they called it protection of the interests of the South and the general interests of Sudan at large. However, there were differences that among the 12-member committee, and there were a critique against this committee, and then things changed 180 degrees when Sadiq al-Mahdi was the prime minister in 1966, and he approved and he showed 100% approval of the interests of the South. So unfortunately, the political differences were very influential at the time. Nevertheless, we can consider that the Roundtable Conference and the 12-member committee laid the ground or paved the way for the coming agreements that took place between the north and south of Sudan. After that, there was the Ma'awiya era in 1969, and then we're not going to talk about that. We will reach to February 1972 when the negotiations were launched in Addis Ababa, and it was called the Addis Ababa Accords. Of course, Addis Ababa was very important because the African Security Council were functioned there, and reaching agreement is one of its functions. But this mitigated the war that was taking place, and the Anania forces have been fighting for 17 years in the south against the central government, and they were absorbed in the army. And one of the important outputs of this accord is not only putting an end for the fight, but to have a regional government of the south.
ده طبعا كله أثر على
All of that impacted stability in Sudan in general and building a trust. And some of the most important achievements after the Addis Ababa Accord, that there was self-sufficiency in food, and there were more schools, and the Juba University was created after that accord. But as usual, in Sudan, things always get into a relapse.
عزل أبي الألير عزل حكومته ولعل من أسباب ذلك تخوف نميري من هيمنة
The
الإقليم
government was
المركز وطبعا بالتأكيد هناك أسباب أخرى
was dismissed, and Numeiri maybe did that because he was afraid of the influence of the regional government. The conflict, we can say that is not a conflict between the south and the north, but actually it is a north-north conflict as well as a south-south conflict. So there were the conflict between Abel Aller, who is from the Daito tribe, and this is a tribe in the south. It's one of the largest tribes in Africa, and there was a reference to the importance of the delta. And there was the equatorial forces as well, or the equatorial conflict against the others as well. So this led to differences or disputes between different regions, and that was in the 15th of May 19 something. Because that this is a very important date. Why? Because some people link the collapse of the Addis Ababa Accord with the implementation of the Islamic Sharia. The implementation of the Islamic Sharia was in 1983, as they are called the September laws. The collapse of the Accord and the Numeiri, it was in June 1983. So people should not link the implementation of the Islamic Sharia with the collapse of the Accords. Nevertheless, we say that the Addis Ababa Accord in specific represent the only experience since independence that provided a practical solution for ending the war and stopping the bloodshed that was continuing for 11 years. So since independence, the fighting stops for 11 years. And the accord also proved that the peaceful solution should go through dialogue, and that citizenship is the ground of all the ethnic backgrounds or all the ethnicities and the diverse backgrounds in the Sudan.
أسباب الوحدة المفرطة. يعني كان في حكم إقليمي
At that time, the reasons for separation were established, and the reasons for unity were also removed.
بعد ذاك جات انتفاضة أبريل في 85.
Then we had the April Uprising in 1985. which presented the opinion of people who are looking for freedom and independence. The military operations were increased, and Garang's role increased. Garang thought that getting the authority after the April Uprising, it will be just something so natural, and he said that there will be a Numeiri approach without a Numeiri. Nevertheless, the dialogue started once again, and there were two initiatives: the initiative of Kugadam and the Sudanese peace initiative, which is called the Garang Margami initiative. The Kogadam initiative. It was by Sadiq al-Mahdi and the Ummah or the Nation Party and the Sudanese Peace Accord. It was between the Margami and the Popular Party. This also shows the differences that were there, because as a government you were supposed to be all on one page.
مبادرة قائمة بذاتها.
But each party within the government made a different initiative. The Sudanese Peace Initiative most prominently included bringing back the laws of 1964, and that was the main motive, I believe, for the coup in 1989, which stopped the third democratic government. There were other problems, military and political ones, which increased the cost of the war and stopped education, and the Juba University was moved from the south to the north, and there was so many deterioration in the. There might be other problems that were not mentioned that led to the coup in 1989, which means that the Islamic movement was looking for a complete or a complete development, because the Islamic movement didn't want only to be part of the Ummah, but to be a pioneer with providing solutions for the world. The most important or the most prominent characteristics in this period was the ethnic disputes between the north and the south, and linking these disputes with the Islam and Arabism. So there was a lack of a trust. All of that was there since the beginning of independence, and since even before the independence. But the continuation of this dispute or this conflict, there was a deep conflict. I'm not saying that the North didn't have a share in the marginalization of the South. I always give an example. For example, the Juba University. The first step I had in higher education was in Juba after the Addis Ababa Accord in 1975. It was established, and not a single southern dean of university was assigned in Juba. They were only assigned there after 2005, after the comprehensive peace accord was made. Although it is a university in the south, nevertheless, no southerner was assigned as a president of the university. I will not go on to talk about the agreements that were made in the 1990s between the Salvation government and the movements that that descended from Abuda II and the Khartoum Peace Accord. All of these initiatives, they didn't have the same importance of the comprehensive peace accord of Sudan. The main faction was the popular movement, Sudanese popular movement, which had an important role. They had a large political role, and it was the most prominent politically and militarily, receiving external support. Afterwards, there was interest to reach agreement between the two parties, and the most important objectives were drought and desertation, and also the development. And its name was the Governmental Committee for Drought and Desertification, and then it became Intergovernmental Authority for Development. So development has become important for it. That's why the importance of the IGAT countries to end the war in the south was very important, and they had a positive impact on the countries of the organization. Therefore, the IGAT created a committee led by the Kenyan president, and they presided over reaching a peace agreement, and it was biased clearly to the as it was shown in the announcement or declaration of principles to the south in terms of the self-determination and the secularism of the state. The separation of state from religion from the state was very clear, because they were afraid that the Sudanese government will export its projects. And this is very important because there was so many countries were in favor of the Pan-Africanism. But when we look at the mathematical formulas, we can see a lot of negative aspects and positive aspects. So the African countries, although they are in favor of the Pan-Africanism, they reject to export or to copy the Islamic project in their countries. So there was a new chapter of negotiations between the popular movement and the central government, which is the Comprehensive Peace Agreement (CPA), and I believe that this was the most important agreement that happened in Sudan. The meetings continued for 2 years and a half before signing the final version in 2005. The agreement, of course, included the six well-known protocols. I'm not going to mention them now. And the agreement also included a framework for self governance for 6 years, and afterwards of which the self-determination will be decided. The most important things that were decided by the agreement is to have a southern entity, a federal entity, and a northern entity. The most important changes, or what has been changed from other agreements, was the issue of the oil, because the oil had a completely different aspect in that agreement.
انتهى اذا ممكن نوجز في
Your time is almost over, so you have to finish, please. Please give me some time because it's very important.
25 دقيقه فاحنا
There are some important points I want to finish. Okay, but your 25 minutes are over. Okay, I'm trying to not to mention a lot of points, but the issue of the religion and the state is very important. There was a very important question, which was the Salvation government got into negotiations of separating the state from the religion, and what did they replace it with the self-determination? So that was, we have a question. Was there this trade-off that we give you self-determination, but but you have to agree on not to separate the religion from the state? And the international and regional factor was very important one in terms of reviewing everything militarily and politically. After negotiating about this issue, the IGAD reached a middle ground about separating the south from the north and separating the religion from the state in the south. I believe this was a very important topic, because the self-administration is a very important one, because it started to appear since 1991 instead of federation. The federation or federalism was rejected by the governments of the north. We know that the slogan that was used, no federation for one nation. So federalism was rejected highly. So it was even a very well, it should have been more obvious to reject self-determination, because that led to worse off results and led to the complete separation of the South. That was clear in the demand of some factions in Darfur for self-determination or separation. So I am in favor of the point or the opinion that says that the trade-off between the Islamic Sharia and the self-determination for the South, it was something that is on the table. I believe that the Salvation government, although there was a trade-off, but the Salvation government lost the South or abandoned the South when they opened the space for a referendum, because they could have uh, maintained it by the issue of the pending issues. For example, ABA issue and other issues were not settled. The oil issue were not settled. Nevertheless, the Salvation government allowed for the referendum. We can say that, for example, self-determination that will happen. That's fine, but we don't go for a referendum before those pending issues or standing issues are solved. That was very clear. But it seems that the government had a large hopes that the problem of between the north and the south will take place, and that we will be able to open a new page. And actually, there were some peacetime, but later we discovered that this was just a period, a short period. Then Sudan got into a lot of disputes and differences. The least thing to talk about was that the American sanctions were not lifted after the separation. And I believe that this was the ticking bomb that was about to explode at any point. So depending on a third party like the IGAD was a mistake, and it was used to put pressure on the government. I believe the better replacement or was the Sudanese dialogue or the North-South dialogue in order to get into solutions away from any regional or international agenda. So the problem that accompanied the problem was uh, being on same footing or on equal footing. Members of the popular movement who were rebels, they became champions of peace. One of the most important points was the bilateral negotiations. No other armed forces or armed groups were included, because the national uh, the National Party didn't represent all the North, nor the other party represent everybody. So 80% it was bilateral, whereas the 20% of the remaining parties were just a decoration. To conclude, I would say that there were some positive points here, because to talk about this bilateral, it was not only a dual or a bilateral negotiation, because it was a period of transition to other. Because there should be a respect for the the agreement, and then to agree that Arabism is uh, the cultural bond between the people of Sudan, and that unity allows for diversity. That's all from me. Thank you very much. This is all from me. Thank you
عليكم
for
السلام
this
ورحمة الله.
opportunity
شكرا
in this
جزيلا
report.
دكتور هويدا
Very much, Dr. Howaida,
لهذه المداخلة.
for this paper.
كانت هذه المداخلة حقيقة هي قراءة للاتفاقات
This was a reading in the different
داخل السودان
agreements
بين
that were
الشمال
reached
والجنوب.
in Sudan between the south and the north, and this it was presented as lessons learned. She started saying that the fabric in Sudan is complicated, and the wars that took over half a century through political pressure or calling for self-determination or federalism with the central government, and by providing them with assurances and regional interests. Sudan was governed by democratic regimes that were weak or dictatorships. So those democracies were uh, busy with fights between the two main parties, and they didn't deal with this major challenge that led to the split or the division of the country. She mentioned the different agreements that took place, in specific the first one from 1964 to 1969, which was about the South. Maybe this was the spark, or the spark of this agreement was in a lecture delivered by Al-Turabi, but the issue was to find as unconstitutional and legal situation or status for the country. And then there was the round table conference that was the beginning of finding solutions between the South and the North. However, in 1969, there was Al-Numairi eliminated this agreement by the issue of self-determination. The most important thing is that the militias of the South were contained in the army, and it stopped some of the tensions that happened, and there was a university established in Juba. Nevertheless, she mentioned that Al-Numairi uh, ended that agreement, and then the African Union, or the matter of the African Union, sorry, the IGAD was the one that was concerned to find a solution for this problem. The conflict was not only a north-south conflict, it was also a north-north conflict, south-south conflict, and she talked about the southern conflict in terms of the Dinka, and which was one of the largest tribes, and the Lago faction Numairi was in line with, and there was a real division in the south. She also said that the reason for the collapse of this agreement were not the September laws, but rather they were in June, which means 2 months before the implementation of the Islamic Sharia in 1983. The Addis Ababa solution was the only attempt to find a solution, and it lasted for 11 years. It was based on citizenship, the rights and duties for all, and after the April Uprising in '85 and the emergence of the role of John Garang, this agreement reached an end. There were later two initiatives to find a solution for the South. One was by Al-Sadiq Al-Mahdi, the other one by the Mergani and the Popular Movement. And it shows that the South, the North was also not unified in their approach. And these two initiatives were independent from each other, and they led to The second one was looking for eliminating the Islamic Sharia, and maybe that was the main motive for the coup in 1989, in addition to the economic and political deterioration in the country and an increase of the displaced people, in the numbers of the displaced people. The most important challenges that happened was the challenge of the Islamic and Arab identity, and there was a huge conflict between the North and the South about that. And she also gave an example that, for example, most of the presidents of the University were not from the South, and she also said that the right to self-determination was the one that was led at the end the complete separation of the South, and she believed that the Salvation government was responsible for that was a big mistake, and maybe the reason for the self-determination was in vis-a-vis federalism, which was rejected completely, which didn't leave the Southerners with any option but to call for self-determination and under the one country, which may lead in the future to the insistence of other areas like Darfur and other areas to follow suit. The Salvation government should have, for example, committed to self-determination without going for a referendum before the pending issues are solved, and because the Americans divided the country, and depending on a third party was a big mistake, and there should be a dialogue between the North and the South without any third country, because they were treated as equal parties, and it became as a state. The South became a state, and equal to the North. And she
ننتقل الآن إلى
That's all from the paper. I tried to summarize it. Now we move to the lecture that was written by Dr. Hassan Makki, and it will be delivered by Mr. Walid Al-Tayyib. He is a journalist, academic. He worked on different online websites like Islam Online, and he was received the award of the National Journalism in 2012. And now he is a lecturer in the African Research Center in the International African University. He has the master's in sociology and the PhD in from Hacettepe University in Turkey, and he is concerned with the issues of Islam, society, and the Islamic movement. We call him to present the paper in 20 minutes. Please, the floor is yours.
بسم الله.
دكتور وليد تسمعني؟
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
تفضل.
واحد سعيد أن أكون جزء من هذا المؤتمر الكبير، ولذلك أيضا الواحد كان يتمنى أن يكون بروفيسور حسن مكي مقدما لهذه الورقة، لأن البروف طريقة آثرة جدا في الكلام، ويخرج من الورقة أحيانا بمعلومات إلى معلومات قيمة فيما يتعلق بموضوعها.
Thank you so much for your introduction. The paper is called Separation and Political Life in the South. This paper talks about separation.
وليس هنالك جنوب أو حياة سياسية في الجنوب بغير هذه المفردة، سواء كان الآن أو حتى قبل حدوث الانفصال.
There was no political life in the South before or after the separation. It talks about the South as it was next to Sudan in 1979, like the Golo region in Uganda and other regions, such as the administrative regions annexed to several African countries at the time of colonization. The paper says that the South was not part of the national identity of Sudan and did not contribute to the making of the national identity of Sudan, and that the South itself was not a single political entity and does not have a single or unified a cultural identity, but it's a multi-identity region, and it's not really a homeland because the Southerners do not regard the modern state negatively. The state for them is tight restrictions and tax collection. So the Southern laymen do not positively regard the state.
الفتح المصري لتلك الأنحاء في القرن التاسع عشر.
Even in the 19th century, in their interaction with the colonization or the Egyptian conquest, that they refused the modern state.
وهنا يمكن الإشارة إلى ذلك النظرية الانقسامية المشهورة.
We can talk about the Evans Richards separation theory, where he said that the tribe in the south, if it becomes too big, it divides up because we have an authority or a power struggle, which means that centralization is not a stable concept in Southern conceptualization. Dr. Ali al-Mazrui talks about two types of modernization in Sudan. The first was the hard or solid modernization based on education and on education and industry, which happened in the north, and the soft or fragile modernization based on learning foreign languages and having the Christian faith, which was what was happening in the south, and this led to a lot of difference between the culture that's rampant in the north versus the south, and this discrepancy led to many problems. So the first seed of separation started with the alliance between the rebellion movements in the south, and the East African Christian front as well. So this theology political annex or alliance led for the rebellion against the state and for the demand to separate, and that this separatist mentality persisted in the southern mentality even during negotiations and when signing mutual agreements or bilateral agreements. Even the latest version of the liberation of Sudan was the discourse or the approach was based on the ally in Ethiopia, who was a communist and who were in conflict with Eritrea. So the Sudan Popular Liberation movement had to get along with the Ethiopian ally, but there was another discourse, which is the marginalization discourse in Sudan, that they could govern Sudan and restore the homeland. The author here uses an approach in which he reviews the existing literature by the Southerners, and written also by people who are close to them. Can you please get closer to the microphone, Dr. Walid? So the writer or the author actually chose 11 books or intellectual outcomes for 5 academics, including 4 Southerners, and the 5th is Abbé Allaire and Joseph Labo, with his biography or journal, and Struggle for Freedom by Malog, and also an African Revolution by another writer, and by a Kenyan writer, Muzaka Wahina, to talking about General Symposia, who was the Kenyan mediator who contributed to the making of the peace process between the North and the South. And he also refers to the book North-South Relations in Sudan since the Addis Ababa Agreement, and the book by the former Minister of Higher Education about the aspired role of Ethiopia, in addition to a number of novels by Francis Dabe, and another novel that talks about missing children or lost children who escaped the civil war to Kenya at first, and then to the United States, where the United States opened its arms and they became well-known figures, according to the novel. And another novel by Philip de Comta, The Acts of Faith. He used to work as a relief worker, and he's a very well-known journalist. And in this novel, he talks about the suffering of the Southerners at the hand of the Arabs that are portrayed as the devils from Cordovan. And finally, he talks about Sudan in the Arab perception from the point of view of a northern Sudanese writer, but who wrote about the South with a bias to the South. The point here is that the politicians write the political story, but then this political ideology becomes translated into novels, and then it is also received by those who are outside Sudan, be it the Kenyan or the American authors who write stories, who write further stories. So this is the main approach of this paper. In the book of Abbé Lapeyre, which is Al-Tamadi fi Naqd al-Uhud, a book on breaking promises, which has become very much known in Sudan. He talks about Sudan, about the southern of Sudan, and he talks about his own biography, and that he was one of the gifts of the Church of the South of Sudan, because had it not been for the support of the Church, he would have died with his mother. And then in 1965, he starts to discuss the issue of the South of Sudan, and he mentions the incident, or sorry, the speech by the Sono party leader, which all boils down to this fact, or to saying that the separation between the South and the North plays in the best of both the North and the South. And he wasn't talking actually about Sudan, but about separation between the South and Arabs at large. And this was the core of the discourse of the South at the time. And then this book talks about the central idea of the North-South conflict, which says that the South tries to secularize the North, and the North tries to Islamize the north, the south, and that there is always a sense of suspicion against Arabs and from southern politicians who work with Arabs. So in this book, he speaks on the tongue of a southerner he called Mundane, who says that those from the south who deal with Arabs have definitely been bribed by Arabs. And then he talks about the promises and pledges that have been broken between Arabs and the south. And he refers here to some of the points of the agreement that were cancelled. So he doesn't refer to previous attempts to overthrow or to rebel against those attempts, agreements, and he also avoids any mention of the fact that the demand to separate or to was made by Joseph Lado, who was the head of the separatist movement, and he avoided talking about the conflict between Numeri and Garan. But he mentions that Joseph Lago was honest when he talked about the making of the Southern Revolution, and he refers to the Christian route with the support from the Christian Association, and that they used Anania, which means the black serpent, in hope to overcome the the state in Sudan, in the north of Sudan, the way that the Kenyan same-named movement overcame its colonizer, and then he talks about their movement having received support from a Tango, and that General Mobutu Seseko, who was the president after that, he said that your enemy, dear Southerners, is the same as ours, which is Arabs. And then he refers to negotiations with Israel and mutual support, or the big support that the Popular Army received from Israel. And then he wrote a letter to Numeri, where he called for the division of the south into 3 regions, and the irony was that the council helped them in writing this letter along with Hassan al-Turabi. The third book is The Struggle for Freedom. Arija, the author, would not hide his separatist wishes. He says that after the war, after the separation, he would go back to his ancestors' traditions, and he says that the south were the angels and the north were the devils, and that the Arabs were the reason for the misery of all southerners, and that the first peace agreement in 1979 was not based on a permanent solution approach, but it was based on a tactical agreement in order to get to the point where it's possible to work on the separation of the South. He says that John Garang himself used to believe in this tactic, and maybe it's we should wonder whether there is a relation between this idea and the eruption of the rebellion 10 years later after the agreement. According to Hassan Makki, this book constitutes a very good historical study to get to know the Southern mentality and its affiliations without any aesthetics, so to speak. And he says that the man was honest when he talked about the death of John Garang, that he said that there are 3 parties who stand behind that, who are southern traitors, the North Arabs, and also the colonized author's economic interests, and no other Southerner dared to mention all of those. The fourth book was by an important figure from the Faculty of Engineering, and he was also a foreign minister, and in 1992 he led a separation from John Garang, and this separation was based on the position from the right to self-determination, but we are told also that there was no direct reference to unification within the popular movement, and even that the awareness among the ranks of the Sudanese Liberation Army was not the same. And they thought that when they take over, he talks about the public sentiment of the army, that it wasn't unified and it wasn't unitary, which means that the rebellion has never aimed at unification. The fifth book was not by a Southerner, but it was written by a journalist, a Kenyan journalist, about General Symposia. The mediator, Mr. Hassan Makki, says that he met this general, and that during negotiations, and that he was less competent or unqualified for the undertaking he was taking, and he hoped otherwise, but at the end of the day the agreement was reached. But the vision and the image of the general was in this by this journalist, it was that this mediator provided an important service to them, and that because he was a true Christian and he was a good mediator. Also, the book talks about the killing of John Garang, and that all parties used to support separation, and that a poll was made by the United States, reaching to the fact to the result that 95% of the Southerners prefer separation, and that the surrounding or neighboring countries were not in support of unification either. Also, in Mansour Khalid's book, he says that Mansour Khalid, he also adopted a discourse in which he tried to make Sudanese feel to blame for the mistakes they committed against the Southerners. Mansour Khalid considered the right to self-determination appeared in modern Sudanese politics very clearly in the agreement signed between Al-Hajj Mohamed and Lama Hall in 1994, and after that he said that it has become a reality. The ominous bird by Francis Dane is in other book in which we have the character called Ilyas. Dr. Walid, would you please be as brief as to finish in 5 minutes, please? Because there are 12 books. We cannot review all of them, really. What Dr. Hassan Makki is trying to say is that the people should free themselves from the feeling of guilt for this separation. The Northerners should understand that this separation has been part and parcel, a deeply rooted idea in Southern culture, and it was an overwhelming southern demand. So it was inevitable, and he believes that the separation or the right to self-determination was an answer to one of the problems in Sudan, and this answer was provided by the referendum among the Southerners, and that now we must think about broad economic alliances with the South as well as with neighboring countries, and to look with good admiration to the transformation in their regard in the South towards the towards Islam, and that in Juba, we last Eid, we had more than 20 sites for Islamic prayer, Eid prayer. So it's because they have overcome their hostility against the North Islamic imposition. So there is now a venue and room for interaction and for better economic relations. Thank you so much, Dr. Walid Al-Tayyib, for presenting this paper by Dr. Hassan Makki, presented by Dr. Walid Al-Tayyib. It refers to the fact that, to the idea that the separation was the oxygen of the southern, of the culture in the south, and that
وأن الجنوبيين مجتمع قبلي كانوا ضد المستعمر.
The south was a tribal community against the colonization and against the multiple governments. They had a bad regard to centralization and even the issue of modernization. They did not have a single position towards them. And Dr. Ali Mazrui mentioned that there were two different conceptualization of modernization in the north and another in the south. The paper reviewed a number of authors and books referring to the question of this south, and those books would consider the discourse of the south, such as the novels that were inspired by that discourse, such as the novel by Mansour Khalid, which is the novel that changed the political discourse into a literary and cultural discourse to become part and parcel of the collective consciousness, and that separation was an answer to the public sentiment in the South. So the discourse in general was meant to instill division between the Africans and the Arabs, and he talked about many books that referred to the conflict between the South and the North as the conflict between secularization and Islamization, and the conflict between the Arabs and the Africans. And even there was a book that referred to the Arabs as the enemy, and he would even commend relations even with Israel. And he wrote to Numeri suggesting that the South should be divided into 3 regions. This is something they referred to in earlier papers as well. So the problem for them, even in the eyes of George Garang, he believed that they regarded the Arabs as colonizers, and those books would reflect the mentality of the South. And he talked about the partner of George Garang in his book, not George Garang, but also his ancestor, who was a separatist. So ultimately, this separation was a southern, deeply rooted, decades long or old idea in the southern culture, and that it happened when it was inevitable, and it answered one of the major questions that Sudan has faced in its history. So now broader issues have to be considered, such as the historical relation between the North and the South through wide reaching its economic relations, and that the complex against Islam has ended, and that the Islamic culture has become part of the culture of the southern community. Thank you, Mr. Walid. Now we move to Dr. Al-Kabbashi with external or foreign relations and international relations in the Government of Salvation. Please go ahead.
اسمعني دكتور إبراهيم. نحن لا نسمع. هل بدأت الحديث؟
We can't hear you, Dr. Ibrahim.
دكتور ابراهيم انت عامل ميوت للمايك تاعك.
تعمل انميوت دكتور ابراهيم، محتاج تعمل انميوت انك تفتح الصوت. الصوت عندك مغلق.
طيب
الان الصوت. الان نسمعكم. نعم.
Yes, we can hear you now.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
ممكن ترفع
بسم
الكمامة.
الله الرحمن الرحيم.
إذا ما في مانع.
Could you remove your mask if there's no one around? Thank you so much.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
الورقة التي بين
paper before you is a paper in which I tried to talk to non-Sudanese, and that's why in its introduction it included a number of considerations and the explanations that may not have been very clear for non-Sudanese readers. These are not only concerned with foreign relations and international relations of the Islamic movement, although they have been part of this paper, of course.
لدولة الإنقاذ لحكومة الإنقاذ. دعنا نبدأ ونقول.
Let me start by saying that we are going to touch on some of the aspects without going into the details of a 30-page paper, but let's touch on some of the important issues, particularly in relation to foreign relations. Or before 1984, which is the time of the end of the Numeri era, the external relations.
وإن شغل الدكتور حسن الترابي لمدة قصيرة.
إذا ممكن دوحة 2 إذا تكرمت
موقع في القصر الجمهوري.
دوحة 2 إذا ممكن.
دوحة 2, can you mute your microphone, please?
تيمور بليز.
ما في شخص.
تفضل.
No, it's not clear.
أنت دوح السودان خرطوم 3 لحظة واحدة. أنت الصوت اختفى من عندك دكتور إبراهيم.
We have lost your voice, doctor.
الصوت واضح؟
نعم واضح الآن.
طيب أنا قبل سنة 85 في نهاية حكم الرئيس نميري لم تأخذ العلاقات الدولية.
By the end of the Numeri reign, foreign relations and international relations were not key for the Islamic movement, although Hassan after the reconciliation in 77, they took the file of external relations, and they addressed the US President Ronald Reagan at that time. At the time, external relations were more concerned with relations with other movements rather than. After the reconciliation in 1977, Dr. Ibrahim, your voice is not clear anymore. Can you get closer to the microphone?
منظمة الدعوة الإسلامية كانت جهود موفقة جدا.
They had very successful efforts, and also there was Abdullah Yaqub, whose efforts. Dr. Ibrahim, can you hear me? Dr. Ibrahim.
دكتور إبراهيم تسمعني؟
كانت مفاهيم وتصوراتها فقط لكوادر الحركة الإسلامية من
دكتور إبراهيم تسمعني؟
الكتب القديمة والكتب المعاصرة، ولكنها مفاهيم غير مسعفة لفهم تلاكيك السياسة الدولية الراهنة، ما عدا طبعا المختصين في العلم السياسي في العلاقات الدولية ده مجال محدود جدا.
دكتور إبراهيم
قليلا للحركة الإسلامية في العلاقات الدولية كان بعد انتخابات سنة 6.
Donna, is he audible for you?
It's barely audible. I think something came in the way of the microphone because it was clear at the beginning.
حصل انفتاح كبير جدا.
دكتور إبراهيم
شغل الدكتور الترابي بفترة قصيرة موقع وزير الخارجية.
دكتور إبراهيم
أرسلت الحركة الإسلامية وفود باسم الحركة الإسلامية، باسم الجبهة الإسلامية القومية، وفود لعدد كبير من الحدود من
دكتور إبراهيم تسمعني؟
منهم مصر ومنهم
Dr. Ibrahim, can you hear me?
أوغندا وعدد من الدول الأفريقية. كل ذلك كان طبعا قبل سنة 89 عندما وصلت الحركة الإسلامية للسلطة.
This was before 1989 when the Islamic movement came to power, when while previously they used to sit with parties and factions. When the Islamic movement took power, they of course moved to a different type of foreign relations, and they of course took control of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they started to establish bilateral relations, the United Nations, other states, the African Union. No.
نعم. هل تسمعني؟ طيب احنا كنا ما نسمع.
Can you hear me properly? No, when you started to talk about Numeri, the sound became interrupted.
الآن تسمعني دكتور؟
Can you hear me properly now?
دكتور إبراهيم تسمعني؟
Dr. Ibrahim, can you hear us?
لو تتكلم حتى نسمع ونرى.
Could you please speak so we can check the quality of the sound?
هذا نتكلم الميكروفون. الميكروفون مش الكمبيوتر. الدكتور إبراهيم تسمعني؟
Dr. Ibrahim, can you hear me?
هل تسمعني؟
Dr. Ibrahim, can you hear me?
Okay, Yunus, you need to come here.
Yunus, could you?
We can hear you properly, Dr. Singh.
But he's not giving me any response.
I don't believe you can hear him.
But I asked him if he hears me, and he doesn't give me any reaction. طيب إذا ممكن هل تسمعونا هناك عند الدكتور إبراهيم؟ Okay, mute Sudan too, please. Yeah. اسمعكم، هل تسمعونا؟ نحن نسمعك الآن، ولكن تريد أن الميكروفون يكون قريب منك حتى نسمعك، لأنه كان الصوت متقطع. نعم نسمعك الآن، لو ممكن تقرب نعم حتى نسمع، لو تتحدث حتى تفضل. أسمعك الآن. نعم. نعم. نسمعك. You cannot hear me.
خلاص ما دام انتم بتسمعوا نحن نواصل.
نعم هم
سمعنا دكتور سام بشير.
عندكم مشكلة انتم ما تسمعوننا يعني الكاميرا
احسن شيء كذا لانه ما قاعد زريت
سامي ما سامعك. هل انت سامع
زي انت سامعنا؟ خلاص كده
سامعكم.
طيب قلنا بداية التعامل الفعلي في العلاقات الدولية كانت مع تسلم السلطة في سنة 2000. قبل ذلك لم يكن هناك تعامل.
As I mentioned, before they took power, there were no formal relations, but there were also then international changes worldwide that affected international relations in general around the time that the government of salvation took power, 1989, until until 1991, the relations are the global rules upon which international community changed, and the outcome or the repercussions continue until our day to date. By the beginning of 1991, yes. Since then, there were international efforts, regional and international efforts that joined forces and joined ranks to combat the government of salvation on different levels, objective, diplomatic, military, media, and also at levels that came from neighboring countries, particularly Ethiopia, that was under Leninist communism, and from Kenya and Uganda, who were the main supporter and backer of the popular movement that was that combated the Islamic movement in the north, in addition to combating from the West as well, from Hussein Ali, who was backed by the West and who started some armed movements that destabilized the situation in Darfur to the west of Sudan. In 1991, there were some movements from Chad and elsewhere against the government, and Chad and Ethiopia started an alliance with the government of salvation.
And the popular movement, due to that, the popular movement, which was in fighting the South, it lost the camps that were established in Ethiopia, and it also lost the political and media support that it was receiving from Ethiopia. Of course, Ethiopia was closely bordering the south of Sudan. That led to a positive cooperation with the armed rebellion in the south. In 1991, 92, 93, 94, the Salvation government was basically busy with the war with the south. The war, it was an exhaustive war for human resources and financial resources. Tens of thousands of people were killed in the south, and the Arab countries, even those countries that had mutual defense agreements with Sudan, they refrained from providing Sudan with any means of defense or apart from three countries, which were Iraq, Syria, and Libya, and the supplies from those three countries were very limited. In this year, in 1991, there was the Gulf War, where the Iraq invaded Kuwait, sorry, and the Arab countries were divided into two axes, those that are looking for an Arab solution and others that were looking for expelling Iraq from Kuwait through inviting foreign forces led by the United States. And that led to Egyptian and Gulf boycott with Sudan. At the time, as we remember, some of the Gulf states that have a very high voice that is influential, like United Arab Emirates and Oman, they were out of the sphere of influence at the time. Europe, or the European countries, of course, they were all supportive for the rebellion in the south. Therefore, the new identity of the Islamic Sudan from that support, or they were afraid of that support in the south, and the United States took a position against the Sudanese government since Sadiq al-Mahdi days. And I can say even further that since 1983, towards the last days of Al-Numairi, when Al-Numairi announced or declared a policy that is called good administration, and he prevented his colleagues in the administration and the authority from dealing with any immoral practices like drinking alcohol or other immoral things in 1983, and when he announced the implementation of the Islamic Sharia. At the days I was studying the vision of the World Council of Churches about Sudan. I was working on my PhD, and I was studying their vision 10 years after this agreement. And in Geneva, I learned from the World Council of Churches that they were very upset from the Islamic approach of Al-Numairi president in Sudan. And as other speakers said here in this symposium, they or Reagan sent his the vice president at the days to Sudan with the three well-known orders. The first one was expelling the Islamic movement or eliminating the reconciliation between Al-Numairi and the Islamic movement. The second order was to put the Islamic leaders in the prisons, and the third, retreating from all of the Islamic laws. Of course, Al-Numairi implemented the first two orders, but not to the third order. Then the tension, there was some cold relations and then tension between Sudan and the United States at that time. When the Sadiq al-Mahdi's government came into place, the same tension continued, and I can refer the participants to the book of Robertson. He was the U.S. ambassador to Khartoum, and Robert Collins. The two of them authored this book that was in 1983 or 85 or 86, and they are mentioning this matter in the book. During the Sadiq al-Mahdi's administration, the rebellion in the south increased, and it was almost everywhere in the south of Sudan, and only a few number of cities that were still under the control of the Sudanese government. And that led to an increase of the defense budget or the defense cost. When the Salvation government came to power, it came to find this position. It found that all of the south was out of control, and part of the north were under the fire of the popular movement. That's why the government at the time found a lot of support. And the popular movement, or the political and diplomatic presence of the popular movement in Western Europe and in the United States of America, as well as in the Central African states like Kenya, Uganda, and the South African countries, they became present in all of these countries. The Salvation government found that Europe is closed in front of their faces. The United States is closed. The Gulf states are closed in their faces because of the position of Sudan towards the invasion of Iraq to Kuwait, because they adopted the Arab stance. So Sudan has the only solution for Sudan was to go east, approaching Iran, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, And these efforts were fruitful in all of the aspects with those, or in all of the fields with these countries, especially in terms of oil production and installing the pipelines for from the west of Kordofan through Sudan to Port Sudan, and creating or establishing a port for exportation and a refinery for oil. After that, since August 1999, the first shipment of oil was exported.
ده يعني أحدث تغيرات نوعية في
And
الداخل
that made huge changes inside and outside Sudan.
حالة من الرخاء والاسترخاء الاقتصادي في الداخل.
There was some kind of boom in economy inside Sudan, and that was reflected on the popular movement. In 1996, the popular movement lost control on any important position in the south of Sudan. And these years, from 1996 to 1997, the movement was refraining from going into any political with the government. So there was a change in the power, in the balance of power in this area, because the income from oil was started to flow, and the north of Sudan started to take steps in the defense,
لكن أيضا
as explained in the paper of Dr. Adil a while ago. However, these positive changes at the strategic level for the Salvation government, it was accompanied with negative results, which is the defection in the Islamic movement that took place. And that period, the period of defection, where Sudan was living under a great economic boom. It was economically, it was the best periods. However, at the same time, it was the worst period internally for the Islamic movement because of the defection that took place, because that exhausted the efforts of the members of the Islamic movement and the Islamists in general. And at the same time, there was the rebellion movement in the south. It was working side by side with the opposition in the north to topple the Salvation government. And the Islamic movement, it was the fragmented into the national movement and the National Congress, and then the Popular Congress, and then there were other groups, and there was weakening in this edifice that in the first place allowed the Islamic movement to reach power. And for the first time in 20 years, as I said, the rebellion movement started, and their supporters in Europe, in Africa, in the United States, they started to put extensive pressure on the Sudanese government to reach a settlement with the south of Sudan. And for more than in the past 20 years, the popular movement and their supporters refused a ceasefire or getting into a political settlement. But when the balance of power was shaken because of the great financial revenues that came and that allowed Sudan to have good defense means, and here the popular movement not only looked for peace, but actually its supporters wanted this peace to be very quick. The main reason was not, of course, a, 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 a sudden sense of approaching peace that gets to them, but because they found that the Salvation government was making victory because of the abundance in financial income that was flowing in. I believe since 1994 until the end of the Salvation government, Western pressures intensified upon Sudan in a way that was unprecedented in the history of Sudan. Of course, in the same period, as I said, when this bilateral polarization was shaken, and Russia at the time was busy with its internal organization, and it left the international arena for the United States, and this bipolar world changed into a unipolar world that was led by the United States and Europe doing whatever they want in the world. The notable thing is that during the Salvation period, and let's say since 1994 to 2014, the Security Council issued, and I counted the resolutions, 70 resolutions were issued. Some of them were under Chapter 7 of the Charter of the United Nations, under the title of threatening international peace and stability. All of these resolutions, of course, are supported by Europe and the United States, and they are aiming at putting further pressure or more pressures on Sudan. These resolutions were under the title of human rights, fostering terrorism, radicalism, and I believe each resolution of those 70 resolutions included those points. And until today, without reaching any definition, absolute definition of those terminology, of those terms, Europe and the United States avoid until now defining any term or the term of terrorism. It is used heavily, but they don't seek a legal or a precise legal definition to call an action a terrorist act or not. And I believe that's because they don't want to recognize the peculiarity, the peculiarity of the identity of different nations, of different people on the grounds, and not to recognize the shared commonalities of the human race in the ground, on Earth. This lack of recognition informed those 70 resolution. There is the resolution that was issued in 2006. It was issued by the Security Council under Chapter 7 to establish a judicial and political, military, financial, and security administration in Darfur. In other words, it means that Darfur will be out of the considerations of the Sudanese issue. These decisions were not even present in the war with the South that were going on for 40 years. But when the conflict in Darfur started in 2003, this resolution was issued. the aim is that they decided after 2005, after the increase in the financial capabilities of Sudan, and which led in increase in its capabilities militarily speaking. So they wanted to reach peace and to adopt a policy that led finally to a settlement with the South. But at the time, they wanted to annex Darfur to the settlement with the South. They created a huge international pressure to do that. At the time, the government of Sudan rejected that decision categorically, and at the end, the Western powers submitted to the decision of the Sudanese government. This decision, 1706 in 2006, that was issued by the Security Council about Darfur and annexing it to the issue of the South, the same resolution, it was there was an attempt to repeat the same resolution after the fall of the Salvation government. And here I will refer to the letter sent by the former Sudanese Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok to establish a mission with an financial, military, and security mandate in Darfur. And just as the government rejected this resolution 1706 in 2006, the current government or the military leadership now in Sudan rejected this memorandum that was sent by the Prime Minister to the Secretary General of the United Nations without consulting with any party within Sudan.
متغير الصراع الجديد بعد 2005 قاد
After 2005, there was or the agreement in 2005 led to this settlement with the popular movement, which led finally to the separation of the South of Sudan. The United States didn't and the Troika countries, or sorry, the Western countries in the Western European countries in specific didn't uphold their promises, and they kept.
زار السودان في تلك الفترة لإلحاق دارفور بالتسوية مع الجنوب.
They didn't uphold their promises, and they wanted to annex Darfur to the south of Sudan. And not only those countries, including the Secretary General of the United Nations and the Ambassador of Europe, they were insisting very and very keenly on that. And if Sudan answered those calls, its name will be lifted from the countries sponsoring terrorism that was developed by the United States, and they were some of their debts will be exempted or written off, and with a lot of other incentives. In addition, there were lengthy phone calls between President Bush and Al-Bashir, and as well as the foreign minister of Al-Bashir to Colin Powell. All of these calls were calling for stepping up the settlement with the South, because the human and financial cost that these countries were providing for the South for a long time became not accepted, and too many. At the time, there were new means or tools that started to appear in the conflict. There was the private sector that started to work in the South and in Darfur. Here, I would like to refer you to the book written by Jeremy Stucker. It's called Black Water. As well as other books. One of the writers is called Max Boot. He was a writer, a contributor in the Los Angeles Times, and he was calling for occupying Darfur using mercenary armies, and he said that it will be less costly and more effective to do that. The notable thing, Dr. Ibrahim, you have only 5 minutes to conclude. One noticeable thing is that one of the founders of Blackwater, the mercenary company, was working in Sudan, and he was aware of the issues in Sudan. His name is Cofford Black. At the time, the Sudanese government resisted these goals, and because it was holding together, it could reject and stop those attacks. But there was another reason. There were 120 organizations that came into Sudan using the political openness that was made by Sudan, and these organizations, these NGOs, started to use agents inside Sudan, and they are the ones that led to the great movement which accumulatively led to the collapse of the salvation period. Why I mentioned in the paper the 7 books that were, or the 7 entities that are working in this Sudanese issue, and the last one was the youth. And recently, more than 120 universities were established, and every year they are pumping into the society thousands of graduates in different fields, and they are unemployed for several years. The countries that were receiving labor stopped doing that. Each one of those millions of the young people, we are talking about more than 12 million male and female graduates who are unemployed for 5 to 10 years. They became hopeless, and so many of them were disappointed. So all of that created the social environment for those young people who are connected to the internet through their mobile phones, watching their counterparts in the world, what they're doing. Those organizations made use of the openness and called those millions to revolt against the government. And finally, this led to the mobilization, which led to toppling the salvation government. So there was the explosion was very likely, and it happened at the end. If you allow me, Dr. Sami, finally, I would like to thank you for this great invitation, but there are some titles, so I hope that your organization and other organizations like yours can talk about it in more deeply. Everything that was spoken about Sudan in these 2 days could be a platform or titles for master's dissertation and PhD proposals. including, for example, the talk about the military and security aspect in my country, Sudan. I mentioned in the paper that I counted since the 50s until the end of the Salvation government, 39 military incidents in which the army participated directly or indirectly in the Sudanese politics, including the current situation. About 6 or 7 of them, they were people in the military reached authority. So this formula between the civilian and military and the authority and the army requires deeper study. In addition to that, the phenomenon of the NGOs at the end of the Cold War and the end of the bipolar world, the Western countries and Australia and started to use NGOs as their branches to destabilize the political systems in the countries, just as they are doing in the Sudan, as well as the armies of private companies. Right now, there are more than 100 companies that are providing armies in private sectors, and some of them are working inside Sudan and around Sudan. In addition, the duality of the tribal and familial system and the overlapping of geopolitical position, especially that there are tens or scores of tribes that are living between Sudan and Ethiopia or Chad or Ghana, and you can't differentiate between who is Sudanese and who is not. And I believe for those who are interested in the geopolitical aspect and the this deteriorating tribal effect and the quick changes or the swift changes in the centers of power in the world are obvious, as well as federalism. I wrote a book about federalism in 76, and now it is a proposed, it is something that is proposed in our countries. Sorry, in 78, I wrote that book.
الدبلوماسية نفسها
Diplomacy itself has changed. The notion of sovereignty deteriorated, and with this deterioration, we can see this intervention of 120 organizations in the affairs of Sudan. And as it was clear after the end of the Cold War and the attempt to change, even without having legal text to change the counselor and the diplomatic work since the Vienna agreements or the Westphalia agreement and the agreements in the West Europe, and depending the sovereignty of countries on their countries. In the past 20 years, these notions started to change, and now we hear that the humanitarian intervention, which is a not well-defined term, because to identify what is a human and what is shared to humanity and what is peculiar to sovereign countries is not well defined. So for all of that, I hope that your center and university institutions similar to your center, like the one in Doha and others, take care of those points. I would also hope, after thanking you, I hope that Turkey, as you are in Turkey, to restore the old relations in with educational institutions in Sudan, between Turkey and Sudan. And I mentioned that Darfur fought only as 1916 as they fought the British, and the British thought that they were against the Ottomans at the time. Now that Turkey is restoring its great history, please don't forget Darfur and don't forget us. Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim, and I'm sorry about some of the technical problems that took place. That's why we're taking more time. In the beginning, Dr. Ibrahim talked about some of the
حكومات الإنقاذ في العلاقات الخارجية.
and that affected the international relations or the foreign relations. He said that in the mid-80s during the Numeiri, the international and foreign relations didn't take a lot of attention, whereas the Islamic movement was very active in this field, starting with the Dr. Tijani and others activities. In the 90s, he mentioned that after the rise of the Salvation and knowing its cultural identity, there were international and regional efforts to fight it in different aspects, including the military, the media, and the regional area, especially in Kenya, Uganda, and Ethiopia, as well as from the north and from the east and west, in Chad by Hussein Hebri, and in Ethiopia by Helia Meriam. And then there were armed movements that were launched from those areas so the Salvation government supported the movements that were against Chad and Ethiopia, and they toppled their attempts. So these issues or these two countries continued to or their support in media and in military weakened after that. But the Salvation government was busy and exhausted in the war in the south that exhausted this Islamic movement and the country and or the Sudanese state. And actually there were some countries, even the Arab countries that have bilateral defense didn't commit to these agreements except Iraq, Syria, and Libya. Afterwards, there were because Sudan in the invasion of the Iraq to Kuwait, Sudan took the Arab solution, and the United States and Western Europe, they were supporting the movement, the rebellion in the south. The United States, of course, was against Sudan since the state of Sudan adopted the Islamic Sharia under the days of Al-Numeiri. The World Council of Churches had the role in supporting the rebellion in the south, and they were upset about the implementation of Islamic Sharia. Then he talked about the calls between Al-Bashir and Bush, and about and then the orders that were sent to Al-Numeiri to put the Islamic leaders in prisons and to not to go into the Islamic the implementation of the Islamic Sharia. And one of the reasons that came to the Islamic, when the Salvation government came to place, they found that most of the south was not found that most of
كانت مغلقة أمامها وتوجهت إلى الصين وإيران وإندونيسيا
وماليزيا. They found
that
most of the south is not under the control of the government, and the north is under bombardment of the rebellion. And then because of the closure of the countries in front of the Sudan, they went east to Asian countries, and then they started, when the oil was discovered, they started to have they laid down the pipelines for 100,600 kilometers to from West Kordofan to Port Sudan, and the income started to flow into Sudan. So all of that changed the relations, and it led to some negotiations and some concessions. Of course, all of that led to some that was accompanied with some negative aspects because of the defections within the Islamic movement. So that was a period of economic boom, but inside within the Islamic movement, it was a very bad period, which led to a defection from the movement and the poor presence within the government. So the Islamic movement was divided into the national and the popular movements, and they were whereas the popular movement in the south was present in the Western European countries and in Africa. In 1980, from 1989 to 2016, with the loss of the bipolar world and the United States with the hegemony of the United States to the world order, there was more international resolutions against Sudan, 70 UN Security Council resolutions within 20 years. Some of them were under the Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, and most of these resolutions were led by the United States and Western Europe under the titles of human rights, sponsoring terrorism, and other issues, especially that these terms are not well identified or defined internationally without taking into consideration the peculiarities of the nations or what comes under the mutual interest of a human race. Resolution 1706, which was issued in 2006, was calling for a political, judicially and administrative administration of Darfur, which means that it will be not under the control of Sudan. So this means, and then the current or the former Prime Minister sent a letter to the United Nations as if he wants to restore this self-administration of Darfur to itself. He mentioned two books, Jeremy Stakehill, Blackwater, and another book, and those people are the ones who called for the war against Iraq, and they were also calling bluntly to the occupation of Darfur. There are dozens of organizations or NGOs that used the agreement of 2007, and they got into Sudan. More than 120 organizations. They have agents inside Sudan, which led the mobilization in Sudan, which led to the toppling of the government. And they used the political openness in the Sudan, and they tackled or targeted the unity of Sudan. Of course, we have 120 universities that are graduating thousands of students every year. Those students are not finding jobs, they are unemployed. So this led to be disappointed and to be ready to revolt against the government. So these are the issues that can be spoken about. He also spoke about the Congress, and or he was focusing about this conference, and said that we can focus on so many issues, especially the civil-military relations and the military and government relations. And he said that he noticed about 9 military incidents. The army was directly or indirectly involved in 6 or 7 of them. Where they were leaders from the army reach authority, and he was also saying that this needs a closer study, and the role of the armies of mercenaries and the armies of the private companies, as well as the role of geopolitics and the role of tribal system in Sudan and its neighbors, and as well as the international conflicts, as well as the notion of politics in Sudan. Thank you very much, everyone. We are almost at the end of this morning session. We were supposed to have 2 interventions, the one by the former foreign minister Mustafa Uthman Ismail, but unfortunately he was sick, and we hope that he gets well soon. He apologizes so much for not being here. The other intervention will be by Dr. Qudri, but he's not with us. He was unable to attend with us just like yesterday, it seems. He is trying to log in from his house, right? He was unable to log in because of the lack of internet. So these were two important comments or interventions. So we will try to see if one of the speakers can join us in the next session. The next session will be a closed meeting, and it will be recorded, and maybe in the future we are going to broadcast it. I would like to thank all the participants. I want the lecturers who will be with us, who were with us in the third session, to be with us on the fourth session.
يبقى المحاضرون معنا. ستكون هناك
Yes, the lecturers should stay with us because there will be comments. Now it is 2 o'clock in our time. It's 1 o'clock in your time. We will come after 1 hour and 15 minutes. We will have lunch break and prayer break. And in the first half an hour, we will have comments on the third session. And this will be broadcasted, okay?
سنستمع إلى التعليقات.
We will listen to the comments, and we are going to listen to the and then we will move to start the fourth session. Thank you very much. See you after the break.
شكرا.